In the previous episode, we ended on the 30th of September 1942, but just winding the clock back slightly, in 4th Panzer Army's area, there had been attacks against the Axis from the 27th of September onwards. Shumilov's 64th Army basically did nothing, but success was achieved on the 29th against the 1st and 4th Romanian divisions in the Lake area. Here, 2 detachments, one from Tolbuchin's 57th Army and the other from Kolomeit's 51st Army, struck a Romanian division each and did a lot of damage. The detachment from Tolbuchin's army battered the 1st Romanian Infantry Division in the Lake Zatsa area, taking Zatsa itself and the village of Zemkin. And further south, the detachment from Kolomeit's army routed the 5th and 21st Infantry Regiments from the Romanian 4th Infantry Division, advanced 18 kilometers and captured the village of Zadovaya. The defeat that Romanian forces suffered in the vicinity of the Lake region, 60 to 75 kilometers south of Stalingrad, set off alarm bells at Paulus's headquarters. Paulus ordered Kempf to send the 14th Panzer Division south, which it did on the 30th of September. Clearly though, this was an ominous sign of things to come, which was why it was imperative for the Germans to take the city of Stalingrad now, before the Soviets could build up their forces enough to do damage on the flanks. Earlier on the 30th, Paulus still hoped that Seydlitz could continue his thrust the next day, and an order was issued to 24th Panzer Division directing it to advance northwestwards to the area south of the mountain village. By midnight though, it had become obvious to Paulus that Seydlitz's forces were too weak to do this. Even though Seydlitz's divisions had only suffered minor amounts of casualties on the 30th itself, the cumulative losses over the past month were hurting 51st Army Corps' performance. Taking the 24th Panzer Division as an example, it had a ration strength of 13,098 men at this time, but on the 1st of October 1942, it only had a combat strength of 6,943 men. In contrast, on the 21st of August 1942, it had had a combat strength of 9,862 men, so it was down by about 30% of its combat strength that it had had in the mid to late August period. And we have to bear in mind that the division wasn't at full strength on the 21st of August, so the loss of strength between August and October was even more devastating. Some of its individual combat units don't seem to be in as bad a shape as you would expect. Its 24th Panzer Regiment had had 1,962 men in August, but now had 1,572 men. So yeah, maybe a quarter of its strength is gone. But it was the 21st and 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiments that had probably suffered the most. They were at 1,790 men and 1,882 men in the August period, but were now at 1,142 and 1,145 combat troops. That's a drop of 36% and 40% respectively. Of the supporting battalions, the combat strength of 4th Motorcycle Battalion had been 1,134 men in August, but was now just 737 men, again a 35% drop. The 40th Panzerjäger Battalion had 461 men rather than 489, which is very surprising. I'm assuming it had received some reinforcements at some point because it was probably the only battalion of the division that hadn't taken a significant loss recently. Finally, the 40th Panzer Pioneer Battalion had just 307 men compared to the 661 men they had in August. Even its artillery regiment had suffered significant losses, and in effect, the division was operating at 60% of its August combat strength, which, as I said before, wasn't even its full strength back then, so the division was probably operating at about 50% of what it should have been. The lack of assault guns and tanks also increased the difficulty of the task at hand. It was clear to both Paulus and Seydlitz that reinforcements would be needed if 51st Army Corps was to win this fight, and since those reinforcements were not coming, Their only hope was to destroy the Orlovka salient, which would free up elements of the 389th and 94th Infantry Divisions, which could then be used to reinforce Lenski's division. But unlike the Germans, Chuikov was receiving reinforcements. The refurbished 42nd Rifle Brigade had crossed the Volga and now moved to support Yermolkin's division by taking up positions in the mountain village. 42nd Rifle Brigade had been reinforced, going from 600 men to 1,151 men by the time it was sent back into Stalingrad. Of course, this was little consolation to the troops fighting in the Orlovka salient, whose battalions were down to 200 to 250 men each, and who desperately needed support now. The other units were also in bad shape. The 193rd Rifle Division had been at 5,000 men when two of its regiments had arrived on the 28th. Now it was down to just 600 men. All of its regiment commanders had been killed, and 3 battalion commanders were dead too. Yet, despite being on its last legs, and despite now being in the Stalingrad front, itself meant to be on the defensive, Chuikov wanted to take advantage of the lull in the fighting and decided to conduct a large counterattack with the reinforcements he had just received. His hope was to recapture the Narrows region and possibly the Upper Barricadi village. But he wanted to conduct it in 2 phases. The first phase would be a reconnaissance in force, followed by the main attack. So, on the 1st of October, Chuikov got to work on the first phase. He instructed Gurtiev to deploy his lead 351st Regiment between Yermolkin's and Smekhotovorov's divisions to protect the approaches to the Barricadi factory. Then reinforce battalions from 385th and 416th Regiments of 112th Rifle Division and the 685th Regiment of 193rd Rifle Division conducted sorties to feel out the German defences and retake as much ground as possible before the main assault. Unfortunately for Chuikov, the 24th Panzer Division threw back every attack. But the pressure was mounting on the centre of the Axis line, and the Croatians were forced to give up a little ground in the morning. This was soon reversed though in the afternoon, as the Croatians and the rest of Camp Group Pavičić pushed forward again and then continued to gain ground. And it wasn't just Chuikov who was attacking. To the south, during the early hours, about 300 men from the 295th Infantry Division infiltrated down the Krutoy ravine. They surprised the Soviets in their trenches, which they rapidly overcame in desperate hand-to-hand fighting, and actually managed to reach the Volga. They then split in 2, with some men moving north towards Rodimtsev's headquarters, while the others turned south and struck the rear of Rodimtsev's division. Rodimtsev lost contact with his units, and the mortar company commanded by Senior Lieutenant Brick came under attack. Brick ordered all the mortars to be laid vertically, after which they fired directly at the Germans. Simultaneously, more attacks came in from the 194th Infantry Regiment, with the 3rd Battalion of the 39th Guards Rifle Regiment struggling to hold on, as were the 3rd and 2nd Battalions of the 42nd Regiment. Rodimtsev reacted quickly though, throwing into the fight his final 30-man reserve, a blocking detachment. They gathered some retreating Soviet soldiers, then struck back and caught the enemy in a deadly crossfire. The German attack stalled, then withered under a hail of machine gun and later artillery fire, compelling the Germans to fall back and restoring the situation. Much further to the north, at 1100 hours on the 1st of October, the Kampfgruppe of 94th Infantry Division continued its own attack and seized the cemetery to the west of Orlovka. The 16th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe also captured most of Orlovka village itself after 2 assaults. Thus, the Germans had managed to encircle several Soviet units to the north of Orlovka. Thankfully though, the 500 trapped men inside the pocket had enough food for 2 days and a hefty amount of ammunition, about 200 rounds per rifleman and hundreds of artillery and mortar rounds, so they were capable of holding out. And the effort of closing the pocket seems to have exhausted the last of the German strength. That was why, that evening, Paulus decided to postpone his next attack until the morning of the 3rd of October. With his army slowly but steadily bleeding to death, Paulus had no choice but to halt its advance through the workers' villages on the 1st and 2nd of October so he could rest and reorganise the forces of Seilert's 51st Corps and then reinforce them with the remainder of 389th Infantry Division. Once this was done, Paulus hoped that Seilert's corps could finally complete its task. On the opposite side, Chuikov was worried. The failure of the reconnaissance in force was an ominous sign that the second phase of his counterattack wouldn't go so well. Still, at 1800 hours, he went ahead and ordered his forces in the lower Barricadi village to attack the German defences east of the Narrows and in the upper Barricadi village, telling his men to strike with storm groups and then follow this up with consolidation groups who would fortify the captured ground and prevent retreats. In addition, Guriyev's 39th Guards Rifle Division created a second defensive line behind the 193rd Rifle Division, converting buildings and factories in the area into fortresses. This allowed the other units in front of Guriyev's division to conduct Chuikov's attack without being worried of taking too many losses, and then have the Germans counter them and break through to the Volga. Meanwhile, to the south of the city, Heim managed to stabilise the situation on the 1st of October, but wasn't able to push the Soviets back to their original positions. That evening and into the next day, Shumilov's 64th Army joined in with the attack as well, causing even more difficulties for Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. 371st Infantry Division in and to the west of Pashanka was hit by over 5 Soviet divisions. Unfortunately for the Soviets, this attack gained almost no ground and only inflicted 36 killed and 111 wounded on the Germans. But this was the first serious attack made by Shumilov's 64th Army since it had occupied the Bikitovka area, and this should have concerned the Germans. Back inside the city, Chuikov launched the main and second phase of his counterattack on the 2nd of October. The 42nd Rifle Brigade grappled with Kampfgruppe Winterfeld, but, as probably expected, it failed miserably, with Kampfgruppe Winterfeld only reporting that it had repulsed several light reconnaissance probes on this day, a clear indication of how weak the Soviet forces were at this point. Kampfgruppe Edelsheim did lose a few small positions on its left flank, but it managed to stop the newly arrived 351st Rifle Regiment in its tracks. So, while German forces may not have been able to attack, they certainly could still defend. Then again, the attack may have been so weak that the Germans weren't really doing much defending. For example, when the 92nd Rifle Brigade attacked the 276th Infantry Regiment, waking Hull up from his slumber, Hull describes what happened. Rifle shots could be heard right in front of the command post. Then a machine gun opened up, hand grenades exploded, followed by short bursts of fire from Russian submachine guns. But the attack was quickly brought to a halt. In fact, Hull reports that it just died out almost as quickly as it had started, suggesting that the 92nd Rifle Brigade had only mounted a minor reconnaissance mission. Zana's division was also attacked, but again only briefly. The Croatians repulsed 2 Soviet companies and then continued their advance to the first railway line. During this advance, the Croatians managed to capture an entire battalion headquarters from the 883rd Rifle Regiment, showing that the Soviet counterattack had not only been completely unsuccessful, but had failed to even stall the Axis advance. Worse for the Soviets, the captured battalion commander revealed that Soviet morale was low, that the 120 remaining men of the 883rd Rifle Regiment were hungry, and that Lieutenant Colonel Panshin was so stressed with the whole situation that, after the 3rd destruction of his command post, he now spent his days drinking himself into a stupor. When Shmekatvorov visited Panshin's 4th headquarters on this day with a group of soldiers, he discovered the drunk Panshin and relieved him on the spot, replacing him with Lieutenant Oseko, the commander of the division's training battalion. So, while the Germans were suffering, the Soviets were in a dire state as well. Nearby, the 1st Battalion of the 54th Regiment battled with riflemen from the 193rd Rifle Division that were holding out inside the factory kitchen buildings. Viktor Kartashev, the same guy who spoke to the girl who came into his trench looking for water, was in the canteens. The tanks were firing as they went, from every gun they had. Shells and mines were exploding close to us, bringing huge quantities of earth up into the air. All around there were hissing, roaring and wailing. Thousands of splinters and bullets were flying through the air. The Germans had to call in Stukas, artillery, mortars and Nebelwerfers to blast the place. I remember the belt of our machine gun ran out, so a new one had to be put in fast. I went down into the trench for another box, but at that instant a mortar shell exploded close to my Maxim, piercing its casing with splinters, bending its barrel and jamming its breechlock. There was only one thing to do: shoot the fascists with my rifle and hurl grenades at them. Even with Sturmgeschütz support though, they couldn't take the kitchens, and so the left wing of Kampfgruppe Pavichich wasn't able to keep up with the rest of the advance. Then the 339th Rifle Regiment reached the battlefield in the afternoon, but luckily for the Axis and unluckily for the Soviets, it was too late to really do anything. Thus, the fighting for the day came to an end, with neither side really making any progress at all. An ominous sign of things to come. Chirikov now decided to reposition Gertev's and Smekatvorov's divisions into better defensive positions so that they could prepare for the Germans' next move. The 883rd Regiment of the 193rd Rifle Division was relieved by the 39th Guards Rifle Division and was also shifted north to form a second echelon behind the 895th Regiment. It was a good thing that Chirikov gave these orders earlier in the day, because shortly afterwards, without realising what they were targeting, the Luftwaffe bombed Chirikov's command post. Now, if you remember back to when Chirikov first arrived in this area, someone told him that the nearby oil reservoir was empty. Well, it turns out that it wasn't. It was full of oil, and Luftwaffe bombs now struck the thing and it exploded. The earth shook around them as burning oil ran down the bank towards Chirikov. Bombs dropped all over the bank, blowing up the oil tanks full of oil, and a burning mass gushed across our dugouts towards the Volga. The command post was in the middle of a sea of flames. The streams of flame burned everything in their path. Reaching the bank of the Volga, the burning oil poured onto the barges standing near the command post. The burning oil floated down with the current. The Volga itself seemed to be bursting into flame. Another member of Chirikov's staff also described the scene. The Volga looked like it had been turned into a huge flow of molten lava whose flames had been blown to the bank by the wind, setting fire to our dugouts. From the far bank of the Volga, men screamed warnings at the ships on the river, but they were too late to help a rowboat that was in the path of the burning oil. The passengers tried to beat out the fire, but couldn't, and as the flames took hold, they jumped into the Volga. Then the burning oil surged over them. At the same time, a massive plume of black smoke went up into the air that could be seen for miles around, giving a good orientation point for the troops on the ground. This disaster, though, effectively paralysed the 62nd Army, shattering their communications and left the army leaderless for a short time. Krylov got to work reorganising the staff in the untouched dugouts and managed to get the surviving radio working. Concerned that Chirikov and his staff had fled or had lost control of the situation, Yeremenko's headquarters asked them, "Where are you?" Chirikov and Krylov both replied, "We are where the most flames and smoke are." The Germans monitored the radio traffic and realised that this was where Chirikov's headquarters was. They therefore fired mortars and artillery at the smoke, killing staff members at the doorway to Chirikov's dugout. Falk comments. This was Chirikov's 6th close brush with death. He must have been living a charmed life. I think it depends on when you start counting and also how you count it, because including this incident, I've got the Churikov almost died counter at 11. That's not including the time Churikov's headquarters was bombed in episode 25, which I didn't count, but others said that I should have. The problem was that I don't know if Churikov was in mortal danger in that one, but he might have been. So if you do count that one, then it's 12. Therefore, by my count, it's either 11 or 12 times that Churikov has almost died. But yes, I agree with Falk. Churikov wasn't exactly living a life of luxury. But then again, neither was Paulus, who was deeply concerned with the depletion of his divisions. Reports of the situation by the Army Chief of Staff to the Army Group. The Chief of Staff of the Army draws the attention of the Army Group to the fact that the process of capturing Stalingrad is impeded by the extreme weakness of the infantry units there, despite all possible efforts made. New forces are needed. The Army asks to approve the request to transfer new forces. Apparently, on the 2nd of October, Hitler demanded that the city be taken immediately. But, according to the German official history, both the 6th Army's headquarters and Army Group B's headquarters were in favour of a withdrawal out of the city to winter positions, which would have been from the Don north of Vertiachi to the Volga north of Bikitovka. If they had done this, they would have withdrawn the 14th Panzer Corps from the Volga and would have pulled back Seilitz's corps from the city as well. However, before we jump to conclusions, it seems, at least from the Army Group B's perspective, that this was a ruse. Apparently, von Weichs was hoping that, if he proposed this withdrawal, it would spur the High Command to send them more operational reserves. Either way, Zeitzler himself, as well as Jodl and the operations department of the OKH, were actually in favour of suspending attacks on the city, and their argument was that the ruined city was no longer an important communications hub or an industrial base, therefore the reasons for taking it, from an operational point of view, were no longer valid. There was also a concern about the upcoming winter, which we'll come back to discuss when Zeitzler takes his views to the Führer in a few days' time. We'll also see what Hitler's response is then. But there's no indication that Zeitzler was going to send operational reserves to Army Group B, probably because the Germans didn't have any reserves. They were stretched to the limit. And even though Paulus was concerned that the strength of his army was fading, there would be no rest for the surviving men. He was determined to resume Seilitz's assault the next morning. You might think that he would stop for a while, then resume the attack to allow his men to recuperate. But it's almost as if he saw no other choice than to keep trying to take the city, probably in the vain hope that the Soviets would collapse. Also, he knew that the Soviets were receiving reinforcements and that he had to take the city as quickly as possible, otherwise they would get bogged down. Therefore, they couldn't stop. At least, not now. In Paulus's point of view, they had to try again. Therefore, Seilitz ordered Lenski and Jenicke to ready their divisions to strike northwestwards on the 3rd the next day, aiming for the tractor factory area. The plan required that Jenicke's units catch up to 24th Panzer Division's line before Lenski's Kampfgruppen would launch their own attack. So, to give themselves a head start for the next day, at 1100 hours on the 2nd of October, 389th Infantry Division's 545th and 546th Regiments assaulted Hill 109.4 and the area north of the Mechetka River. 1st Battalion of the 124th Rifle Brigade was forced to withdraw in the face of this overwhelming attack, and the line moved forward. For the attack the next day, Winterfeld was to capture the area south of the tractor factory village. On Winterfeld's right, Edelsheim was to take the block of buildings south of the Schnellhefter block and the area west of Sculpturny Park. And the attached 276th Infantry Regiment was to protect Edelsheim's right flank. The sources vary, but Lenski's division either had 28 or 38 tanks for the attack, plus the 244th and 245th Assault Gun Battalions in support of the 389th Infantry and 100th Jaeger Divisions. This meant that the Germans had a total of between 52 and 68 armoured vehicles for this attack, but more likely it was just 52. And while the Jaegers were tasked with striking further east into the Red October village, the left-wing regiment of Wuttmann's 295th Infantry Division was ordered to clear the Soviets from Mamayev Kurgan, capture the military clothing factory, and the meat combine, and the tennis racket areas, and reach the Volga, all of which they had failed to do so far, and after all this, it was then meant to move north into the Red October factory. As if there was any chance of it doing any of these things. And the other two regiments of the division were supposed to defeat the Soviets in the lower Dolgi and Krutoy ravines, again, something they had failed to do previously, then wheel south to assist 71st Infantry Division, which would supposedly defeat the last Soviet strongpoints in the centre of the city, again, something they had failed to do previously. None of this was a realistic goal, suggesting that Paulus was relying more on hope than anything else at this moment in time. On the 3rd of October, the 347th Rifle Regiment of Gurtsev's division arrived at 0430 hours. The 37th Guards Rifle Division also attempted to cross, but couldn't do so because there weren't enough boats. Thus, only a handful of men got across. To the north, the 112th Rifle Division was strafed by Messerschmitts as they arrived at their new positions, and the battered remnants of this division were in no condition to defend against the substantial German attack which was incoming. The Germans, though, were delayed. In order for Jennecke to strike west, the 545th and 546th Regiments had to be relieved by the 267th and 274th Regiments, but this didn't happen until early morning. After marching through the night, we have established ourselves in a shrub-covered gully. We are apparently going to attack the factories, the chimneys of which we can see clearly. Behind them is the Volga. We have entered a new area. It was night, but we saw many crosses with our helmets on top. Have we really lost so many men? Damn this Stalingrad. Nonetheless, the attack went in at 0800 hours after a short artillery barrage. The 544th and 546th Regiments of 389th Infantry Division pushed forwards, being met by strong resistance from Scuba's 6th Guards Tank Brigade, which was assisted by the 416th and 385th Regiments of the 112th Rifle Division. On their flank, 524th Regiment of the 112th Rifle Division and the 42nd Rifle Brigade sat in the upper barricadey village, offering support as well. Behind schedule, Jennecke only reached the Mechetka River at noon, losing 5 killed and 43 wounded in the process. Lenski initially thought that he might have to postpone his own assault, but in the end it wasn't necessary. And at 1358 hours, his artillery also fired for 2 minutes and a wave of Stukas struck the Soviets ahead of them. Then his forces attacked. Did they have enough strength to achieve their objectives? Let's find out. The 42nd and 92nd Brigades were smashed in the initial stages of Lenski's attack and forced back along with other units. Kampfgruppe Edelsheim fought in grinding hand-to-hand combat as it pushed through the buildings and gardens ahead of them, with the left wing almost reaching the line of huge houses north of Skulpcherny Park. The southern wing had a more difficult time and didn't even reach the park at all, although they did take the buildings that overlooked it. This distance may not seem far, but they had completely wiped out the Soviet 92nd Brigade, which had started the day with either 38 men, 92 men, or 1,884 men. Yes, there's a contradiction in the sources there. And with Kampfgruppe Winterfeld rolling through the Silicat factory area, together they had encircled and crushed the 351st Regiment as well. The 351st Regiment fought in a forest of chimneys that was the Silicat factory, inside trenches and cellars covered in ash, suffering terrible casualties in the rubble, and they lost their commander, Major Merkelov, who was slain. Taking charge of the survivors, the regiment's commissar, Frolov, led them out of the encirclement to the Skulpturny Park area. Meanwhile, Winterfeldt pushed beyond the factory and reached his objective for the day, the southern tip of the mountain village. 24th Panzer Division's thrust threatened to split Churykov's defences in two. The only unit left in the area facing Lenski was the 6th Guards Tank Brigade, since the other units were mere shells of their former selves. But then again, so was the Tank Brigade. By the end of the day, Scuba was down to just 10 operational T-34s, 1 T-70 and 6 T-60s, plus about 125 bayonets. The 339th and 347th Regiments of 308th Rifle Division were, therefore, ordered to plug the gap on the northern edge of the Silicate village. To the south, the Jaegers and Croatians fought in the buildings and streets in the western parts of the Red October village, but even though they were almost out of ammunition, the 685th, 883rd and 895th Regiments slowed them to a crawl. The 1st Battalion of the 54th Regiment could only take a few buildings here or there and was unable to reach the railway line. By this point, 2 of the regiments from the 193rd Rifle Division were down to less than 150 men each, and Smekotvorov's riflemen had run out of ammunition and resorted to bayonet charges in their desperation. Crucially, Guriev's 93rd Rifle Division had moved in to support them, yet Kampfgruppe Pavichich was now so exhausted that it couldn't go any further, and the Croatians just sat in their defensive positions along the railway line, conducting minor reconnaissance missions and improving their defences. At Mamiev Kurgan, Wuttmann finally cleared the Soviets from the northern slopes of the burial mound. With barely 100 men each, the 161st and 90th Regiments of Gorishny's 95th Rifle Division somehow held the railway line despite one of Wuttmann's regiments pressing against them. And in heavy fighting from the Meat Combine to the Dolgi and Krutoy ravines, Batiuk's division knocked back every attempt by Wuttmann to break through his lines. In the extreme north though, Andrusenko was in trouble. Previously he had been assured that the 112th Rifle Division would plug gaps in his lines, but this hadn't occurred. Now, an artillery observer and a cook spotted the Germans infiltrating through the lines south of Orlovka. Shortly after, Hill 97.7 fell to the Germans, and this basically split the Soviet lines. The 2nd Battalion of the 115th Rifle Regiment became encircled on another nearby hill, and a crisis began to unfold in the area. That evening, Andrusenko organised a raiding party to retake Hill 97.7, which they did, capturing 8 Hiwis along with other weapons and food. 6 of the Hiwis were shot immediately, and the other 2 were sent to the rear. Clearly though, the Soviet front in the Orlovka area was on its last legs. Churikov therefore ordered his forces to counterattack, which they tried to do but were unsuccessful. Churikov's appallingly wasteful policy of repeated counterattacks astonished German generals, although they were forced to acknowledge that it wore down their troops. Attesting to the ferocity of Churikov's counterattacks, all conducted in the wake of the Germans' dramatic advance, during the evening Kampfgruppe Winterfeldt had to fight hard to retain its forward positions, in what one eyewitness described as stressful and draining work for the panzer crewmen. They didn't go anywhere, and shortly after, Churikov called off his counterattacks, knowing his forces had suffered serious losses both during the German advance and during his counterattack. His line was smashed, and there was a real danger that Lenski could now strike into the tractor factory village and the tractor factory itself in the coming days. But in reality, Lenski was in no position to do that. While he had 36 operational panzers, Yes, he had gained some from the repair shops. His regiments now had fewer than 1,000 men in each. Nonetheless, Seydlitz demanded that the attack continue, so Lenski prepared to advance northeast on the 4th, aiming towards the sports stadium area. In order to take the big buildings opposing Edelsheim, Winterfeldt would need to shift his line to the south, which he did overnight. Once this block of buildings was in their hands, Edelsheim would push southeast to form a defensive line along the park and just north of there. Chirikov only had a few weak formations to oppose the Germans in this area. Luckily, Yeremenko had agreed to send the 8,000 men of 37th Guards Rifle Division into the city, which they did this evening. There weren't enough cutters to get the division's headquarters staff or anti-tank artillery guns across the Volga, so Chirikov had to use his own staff officers to lead the regiments to their positions. But these guardsmen were much needed reinforcements for the Soviets. Paulus, meanwhile, received nothing, and he was conscious of the dire state of his divisions, knowing that without replacements, his units would struggle to go on. Again, he asked von Weichs for more reinforcements. At present, even the breaking out of individual blocks of houses can only be accomplished after lengthy regroupings to bring together the few combat-worthy assault elements that can still be found. Paulus even asked if von Weichs could find a way to transfer the 14th Panzer and 29th Motorized Divisions to the 6th Army so that they could finish the job. Of course, von Weichs couldn't do that and had nothing else to give Paulus, leaving Paulus no choice but to limp on with what he had. Richthofen was, meanwhile, complaining to Jesenek, the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, saying that the slow crawl of the 6th Army was due to a lack of purpose and a lack of a well-defined concentration point. In effect, he was criticising Paulus and the 6th Army for not having a proper plan to take the city. This is unfair though. Yes, it could be argued that Paulus was making some tactical mistakes, and the 6th Army was now stretched across the city rather than concentrated in one area, as we discussed before Paulus' second offensive inside Stalingrad, but the primary reason for this was the lack of manpower and the dire state of his exhausted divisions. Lenski's panzers were roaming around outside or on the outskirts of the city, because Paulus wanted to preserve the little manpower he had left by avoiding fighting inside the city itself. This was probably to buy time in the vain hope of getting the High Command to give him more replacements and reinforcements. It seems reasonable to assume that had Paulus had the manpower, or had he received more replacements, or if more divisions were arriving or were on their way, he would have changed his tactics. So the reason Richthofen perceived a lack of purpose in the 6th Army's tactics was because Paulus's purpose was to preserve his forces and persuade the High Command to solve the manpower crisis. His enemy was as much behind him as it was ahead of him, and the reason why Richthofen couldn't see a well-defined concentration point was because Paulus had nothing to concentrate with. Sure, a few changes of tactics here or there may have put Paulus in a slightly better position, but the main issue remains. He needs more soldiers, and unlike Paulus, Chirikov was receiving division after division of reinforcements, plus march battalions and other units that were supplementing the strength of his army. Technically, Chirikov was still outnumbered and had suffered some major defeats over the past week, but the Soviets were defending the city, which is easier to do than attacking into it, and they were receiving reinforcements and replacements. Through the sacrifice of tens of thousands of Soviet bayonets, the advantage has slowly shifted from Paulus to Chirikov. Yeah, Chirikov was in no position to attack or counterattack despite attempting to do so, but he had the advantage in the sense that the 6th Army had basically run out of steam. All he had to do now was hold on a little longer until the reinforcements arrived and Paulus ran out of men. That may not seem like an easy task, but Chirikov had already achieved his goal. or at least he would do on the next day. Yes, there was one final gasp of effort on the 4th of October, largely thanks to Zhukov finally calling off his second Kotlebane offensive. This granted Huber the opportunity to send some of his forces south to reinforce his Kampfgruppen in the Orlovka area. Paulus therefore concentrated on destroying Andriushenko's forces within the pocket, and also wanted to cut the shrinking corridor between the salient and the factory district. Just before noon, 94th Infantry Division's Kampfgruppen assaulted the 1st Battalion of the 124th Rifle Brigade, forcing it back across the Machetka River. Then, a little later, 16th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppen sliced through the 282nd NKVD Rifle Regiment, splitting it in two and compelling its remnants to fall back. By the evening, the Germans linked up near the river, creating a second Orlovka pocket to the west. Meanwhile, to the south, Seydlitz sent the exhausted 24th Panzer and 389th Infantry Divisions northwestwards once more. Jennecke moved through the gullies southwest of the mountain village, compelling the 112th Rifle Division's 385th Regiment back. Then they combed through several rows of houses, capturing a significant portion of the settlement in the process. After the usual Stuka and artillery attacks, Lenski's panzers and panzer grenadiers also struck the Soviets hard, destroying several T-34s before reaching the Schnellhefter block, where they battled machine gun nests and more tanks from the 6th Guards Tank Brigade. By the end of the day, they had inflicted heavy losses on their opponents and captured the Schnellhefter block and the sports stadium. However, when Edelsheim tried to move on, they ran into elements of Zolodev's division at the railway line, which they engaged. The 114th Guards Regiment had marched up, yes, marched up, to reinforce the 112th Rifle Division and the remnants of the 6th Guards Tank Brigade, but it was hit by small arms fire from Edelsheim's Panzer Grenadiers and then Stukas, which inflicted unnecessary losses on the Guards Regiment, who had been told that the Germans were not in the area. The fact that their anti-tank guns had been unable to cross didn't help matters, as the regiment's commander complained that his anti-tank rifles were ineffective against the German panzers. Nonetheless, with heavy casualties, they helped to bring the Germans to a halt, and Edelsheim decided to fall back to the stadium area. The rest of the battlefield remained static, and so the day's actions came to an end, as did both Zhukov's second Kotlebane offensive and Paulus' second offensive inside the city of Stalingrad. In the previous 8 days, Lenski had achieved almost every objective he had been set, but his division had suffered as a result. Now, 3 of his 4 Grenadier or Pioneer battalions were rated exhausted, and the other being classed as weak. And because 100th Jaeger Division wasn't able to match the speed of the panzers, Lenski had to defend an overstretched right wing, which he simply didn't have the manpower to do. In total, 24th Panzer Division had just 838 combat troops and 27 tanks. In other words, it was barely a regiment, let alone a division. After losing another 23 killed and 89 wounded in the fighting on 4th of October, Lenski informed Seydlitz late in the day that the combat strength of his Panzer Division was insufficient to continue active offensive operations. Because all of Seydlitz's infantry divisions were suffering similar deficiencies in infantry, Paulus had no choice but to end this phase of his assault on Stalingrad's factory district unless and until his army received additional reinforcements. During Paulus' second offensive in the city, the number of battalions that were rated weak or exhausted increased from 18 to 39, and 21 of those 39 were rated exhausted. The 94th Infantry Division's 3 infantry regiments had a total combat strength of just 535 men at this point, which basically meant that 3 regiments had less infantry than the strength of 1 full battalion. The 1st Croatian Company was on its 4th commander since entering Stalingrad 10 days ago, and there were even more weak or exhausted battalions outside the city as well. Clearly, reinforcements would be necessary if Paulus was to take Stalingrad, and yet none were coming. And as a result of the Kotlebane offensives and the need to defeat the Olovka salient, which he still hadn't fully finished off, Paulus's army was now stretched thin from the centre of the city all the way to the north. None of his divisions in the city itself had the strength to achieve even local victories now, and so the only option available to Paulus was to stop the attacks. We're going to discuss the ramifications of this in more depth next time, and also look at another reason often left out of the history books as to why Paulus was forced to stop. But exactly 3 weeks after entering the city and 22 days after Halder had predicted it would take 10 days for them to take Stalingrad, Stalingrad was still not taken, and unlike the first offensive in the city, which had taken almost half of it, Paulus's second offensive had only really been successful outside the city. They had roamed around in the hills and steppe to the west of the city, but once they had entered the built-up areas, their attacks bogged down or were reversed. So they hadn't really taken much of the city itself, more the periphery. And this suggests that the hardest fighting was yet to come. Will Paulus be able to get the reinforcements he needs? Will Chuikov be able to hold the line and relieve the Olovka pockets? And what is the explanation that a lot of the history books leave out as to why Paulus was forced to stop? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.